Miami didn't just run hot in the mid-'80s. It simmered. It hissed. A city of neon facades and backroom fortunes where a handshake could mean a payday or funeral. Cocaine money had turned the shoreline into a glittering mirage, and under that shine, the tide pulled hard. On July 29, 1985, the current finally spit out what it wouldn't swallow. 3 bodies, surfacing one by one in the Miami River, watches still ticking, pagers still clipped on, pockets that didn't fear water but feared the men who put them there. The coroner called it drowning. The street called it something else. And the case, well, the case began right there, with 3 silent witnesses and a river that refused to explain itself. The local homicide crew ran the first laps. Canvases, dockside questions, the usual tight smiles from people who see too much and admit too little. No bruises that made sense. No gunshots to mark the moment. Just the quiet arithmetic of 3 lives, subtracted. The men were Cuban-American, linked to the commerce that rode the river at night. Metro-Dade had its theories. The Drug Enforcement Administration weighed in with a name to ring a doorbell. The son of one of the dead. He answered with red-rimmed eyes and a story that smelled like diesel fuel and ocean salt. His father, he said, had been one of the big movers on the water, thousands of pounds at a time, tucked behind steel ribs and false walls where a torch, not a badge, was the only way to find the truth. He mapped the routine, shabby, steel-hull vessels that didn't turn heads, compartments welded right into the boat's bones, and a patient rhythm. Drift past customs, tie up upriver, let the hull cool for days while lookouts watched for shadows that didn't belong. When the air was clear, midnight vans took the weight and vanished into the lattice of South Florida streets. That last run, he said, never made it to the vans. Blue uniforms, 8 of them, maybe more, stormed the marina, the way only authority does, and the crew went overboard. Every last one. 3 surfaced. 3 didn't. And the cargo? Gone. Hundreds of kilos. The kind of number that can buy a man a compound or put him in a box. If it was a raid, it wasn't in any notebook that day. Every outfit that worked narcotics in South Florida was polled. Nothing matched the time, the place, the boat, which left an uglier possibility hanging in the humid air. Counterfeit authority. The city had seen it before, imposters with rented lights and surplus uniforms, showing the language of the law without its soul. But this time, the rumor forked. What if the badges weren't rented at all? What if the river had pulled down something we weren't ready to say out loud? That's when the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped past the tape. The Bureau didn't come in for color. They came to steady the ground. Their mandate was narrow and cold. Find the truth, even if the truth wore a badge. With Metro-Dade Special Task Force, CENTAC, 26, they built a wall around the case and around themselves. Personnel files were locked away. Home addresses vanished from the usual places. If the hunters could be the hunted, the first rule is simple. Stop leaving footprints. The job, they agreed, was a homicide. If those homicides pointed to police, then the path, however dangerous, ran straight through a precinct door. CENTAC, 26 knew Miami's weather, how the wind changed with new shipment, how violence arrived like a summer squall. They'd been formed to peel back the shell companies and the muscle that came with cartel money. By 85, the open-air firefights had cooled into quieter brutality, but the bodies still fell. Now, with the Bureau at their shoulder, the detectives studied the night shift in Little Havana. Sector 60, a handful of recent hires whose lives gleamed a little too brightly for their pay stubs. One name rose in the chatter, Officer Marco Rivera, a patrolman who walked his beat like he owned the street. Around him, a circle of confidence. Armando Garcia, ambitious enough to co-own a gym. Osvaldo Coelho, retired at 30 and rolling a car that cost more than most houses. The ledger lines didn't add up, not even close. Surveillance is a prayer said quietly, over and over. Coffee counters, parking lots, the glow of a bank's night deposit box. CENTAC, 26 watched the off-duty hours, the fancy purchases, the fast machines, the new pools poured in backyards with cash counted in private. Each snapshot was circumstantial, yes, but the reel kept spinning. The Bureau's analysts traced bank records, side accounts, safety deposit keys. All of it threaded into a picture that suggested something more than overtime and good luck. It suggested a pipeline. Dope stolen before it could be sold. Dollars laundered until they smelled like laundry soap. To crack a circle, you need a crack in the circle. The investigators found him, a wary man named Armando, close to the nightclub owner, Luis Rodriguez, who'd grown tired of seeing his clients shaken down for crumbs. The story as untold it, carefully, haltingly at first, began with payouts to keep the bar clean and evolved into something sharper. Why hassle street-level buyers when you could intercept the real shipments? The proposal was simple if you squinted. Feed the officers a time, the vehicle, the color of the runner's shirt. Let them stop the load. Turn the seized cocaine back to Rodriguez's network. Split the proceeds. Enjoy the silence of victims who couldn't exactly dial 911 to report their robbery. In a city drenched with risk, it was the safest kind of crime, until bodies floated in the river. The Bureau didn't take on at his word. No one gets a free pass in a case like this. They recorded, corroborated, tested the edges. They understood momentum. How you can't just arrest a rumor. You have to arrest the people behind it. And so, step by step, they built the pressure. Subpoenas for bank ledgers. Quiet taps where the law permits. A listening post across from a corner Rivera favored. When the moment came, they staged a disturbance. A fake bar fight called in to draw the officer to the curb. The informant made contact, voice pitched low, talking subpoenas in fear, asking what to say when the grand jury called his number. Rivera took the bait, just not in front of witnesses. When he moved to private ground, the tape rolled anyway, and the words tumbled out, raids, drugs, who stood where when the money changed hands. It wasn't a confession the way television writes them. It was better. A man talking like he was safe. You learn, in this line of work, that a single recording doesn't end a story. It starts to finish. The FBI framed that audio in black steel. Timelines, asset sheets, deposit slips that didn't match pay grade, and set about widening the circle. They knew the danger wasn't abstract. They were threading a needle through a live wire, and you don't do that alone. Federal discipline. The methodical pressure, the technological edge, the patience to sit through 100 empty hours for the one that mattered, became the throttle that moved the case forward. Miami could keep its son. The Bureau and Centec, 26 beside them, were working in the shadows on purpose, and the shadows were beginning to talk. By autumn of '85, the whisper network of Miami was loud enough to rattle glass. Club owners who once feared a knock at the door now hinted at protection they couldn't refuse. Dockside workers spoke of raids that looked official but vanished from paperwork. And in Little Havana's backstreets, men in polished shoes bought more than drinks. They bought silence. The Bureau and Centec. 26 had no illusions. The conspiracy was wide, disciplined, and shielded by badges. The trick was proving it without tipping their hand. The FBI strategy was patient, surgical. They started with the lifestyle evidence. The kind that whispers louder than testimony. Officer Marco Rivera, for instance, a patrolman whose salary hovered in the low 20s, was suddenly rolling a Mercedes with tinted glass, leasing a beachfront condo, and picking up tabs at restaurants where detectives usually ordered coffee on credit. Armando Garcia, another name on the chalkboard, had partnered in a gym that burned cash faster than it earned it. Osvaldo Coyo, retired before his 30th birthday, lounged in a mansion that smelled of fresh chlorine and imported leather. The math was rotten and everyone knew it. But knowing and proving are two different streets. Centec, 26, and the Bureau didn't storm with sirens. They sank into the fabric. Surveillance vans disguised as delivery trucks parked across from bars and gyms. Cameras tucked in false vents clicked off images of Rivera's late-night meetings. Bureau analysts matched serial numbers on cashier's checks, followed the paper trail to safety deposit boxes stuffed with greenbacks, and quietly pulled real estate records that tied shell buyers back to the same tight circle of officers. Every slip of evidence was another thread, and the web was tightening. The real pivot came with Rodriguez, the nightclub operator who'd been paying out hush money long enough to resent it. When his patience cracked, he told investigators about the arrangement. It was bold in its simplicity. Corrupt officers would hit smugglers mid-transfer, using their uniforms as cover. The narcotics, once seized, would circle back to Rodriguez's network. The dealers made their deliveries. The cops took their cut. The suppliers had no recourse. Who files a complaint when the robbers flash real shields? Rodriguez wasn't just venting. He was bait, with bureau handlers guiding him. He staged controlled conversations, hinting at subpoenas, letting Rivera and his associates reveal their paranoia. The tapes caught fragments, enough to show the officers were aware of federal eyes on them, enough to prove they were invested in Rodriguez's continued silence. And silence, in this game, always has a price. Meanwhile, the Bureau mapped the geography of corruption. They discovered river raids had become routine. Smugglers lured with false lights, then stripped of their loads. Some were left afloat. Others never surfaced. The Miami River itself had become a ledger, its waters recording debts in blood and cocaine dust. Each raid not only fed the corrupt cops, it also sowed terror among smugglers, men who would rather gamble with cartels than with predators who could arrest them in daylight. Inside FBI field offices, the case walls grew heavy. Mugshots of uniformed officers tacked alongside aerial photos of stash houses. Arrows drawn in marker connected officers to club owners to smugglers, smugglers to vanished shipments. Each connection meant the circle of trust was smaller, more fragile. The Bureau knew one thing clearly. When the arrests came, they couldn't miss. A botched move would not only collapse the case, it would put lives in danger, including their own. That meant more patience, more tapes, more nights spent listening to static, until a single word shifted the balance. And beneath it all, the noir pulse of the city beat on, salsa rhythms spilling out of cafes, neon lights flickering above streets where deals were made with nods and handshakes, while in the shadows, the FBI was watching, recording, waiting. Miami thought it was the smugglers who had the power. But quietly, carefully, the Bureau was building a case to show otherwise. By the early months of 1986, the investigation had shifted from quiet surveillance into something sharper, more dangerous. The Bureau and Syntac. 26 weren't just listening anymore. They were baiting hooks, lowering them into dark water, and waiting to see which officers would bite. The plan was simple on paper, lethal in practice. Controlled operations staged to look like lucrative opportunities. Informants, men already trusted in the nightlife circuit, whispered to Rivera's crew about upcoming shipments, the kind that promised fast cash. The FBI scripted every line, wired every meeting, shadowed every exchange. It was theater, but with live ammunition. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, and the actors might not leave the stage alive. The first sting unfolded in a bar's back room, a place where the jukebox drowned most conversations, and the owner knew when to look away. Rivera leaned in, asking if Rodriguez's people had been talking to prosecutors. The informant played nervous, too nervous, just as rehearsed. He spoke of subpoenas, of grand jury sessions looming on the horizon. Rivera's jaw tightened, his voice low, a warning dripping with implication. The recorder hidden in a jacket pocket caught every syllable. What mattered wasn't just Rivera's words, but his comfort. He wasn't cautious, wasn't denying. He was speaking as though the conspiracy was common ground, a language both men already shared. For the Bureau, it was gold. One tape like that doesn't close a case, but it paints a target, and Rivera had painted it on himself. Meanwhile, the Bureau spread its net wider. Surveillance teams followed Garcia's gym associates, noting late-night meetings in parking lots. Sudden cash deliveries that matched no business ledger. They traced Rodriguez's payouts, small envelopes moving across bar counters like tips, but fat with hundreds. At every turn, the FBI stayed 2 steps back. Never so close they spooked the prey, never so distant they lost a thread. But the river itself still haunted the case. Informants whispered of raids dressed in blue, where smugglers were stripped of cargo at gunpoint. The Bureau began to suspect the triple drowning wasn't an anomaly. It was policy, a method of enforcement, brutal and efficient, meant to terrify others into compliance. Yet even this cruelty had limits. Whispers surfaced of officers disagreeing, arguments over who deserved the lion's share of a raid. Greed, as it often does, began to fray their discipline. That fracture gave investigators their chance. One night, a contact of Rodriguez's approached agents with a tale. Certain officers were boasting in private. Complaining they weren't getting their fair share, the Bureau pounced, wiring the man, feeding him lines to stoke resentment, to push them into speaking openly. And they did, not names, not dates, but enough to stitch together the rhythm of their operations. Inside the FBI's Miami field office, agents leaned over cassette decks, listening to the grainy voices of men sworn to protect the city confess, indirectly, to betraying it. Each word was another nail in the coffin they were building. The Bureau's methods, deliberate, disciplined, patient, had turned gossip into evidence and suspicion into strategy. Still, they knew the storm hadn't broken yet. Miami was restless, crime still flowing as freely as a tide. But behind facade of neon and music, the Bureau's case file thickened. The noose was tightening, and for the first time, the officers under suspicion could feel it too. Their eyes lingered longer on unmarked cars. Their voices dropped to whispers in rooms they once owned. The shadows they'd ruled were shifting against them. The Bureau knew momentum was theirs. But timing was everything. In cases like this, a misstep could scatter suspects into the wind, or worse, drive them deeper underground where microphones couldn't reach. So the FBI tightened the net slowly, pulling informants deeper, weaving their testimony with hard records, bank slips, surveillance logs, photos taken through rain-streaked windows. One man, known only as Un in the files, became their pivot. He was cautious, always looking over his shoulder, but greed and frustration had soured his loyalty to Rivera's crew. With Bureau handlers guiding him, Un walked into conversations that had once been closed outsiders. He listened to Rivera grumble about cash flow, about shipments intercepted, about the constant pressure of subpoenas breathing down his neck. Each complaint was captured on hidden tape, each one a crack in the facade of untouchable authority. Meanwhile, FBI accountants traced the invisible trail of money. Rivera's name popped on cashier's checks that made no sense for his salary bracket. Garcia's gym ran more red ink than a slaughterhouse, yet his driveway sparkled with new chrome every few months. Coyo, long since retired, had a real estate portfolio built on cash deposits that smelled of seawater and cocaine. These weren't anomalies anymore. They were patterns, and patterns are what the Bureau lives for. Centac, 26 detectives, hardened by years of cartel violence, leaned on their local sources. Street-level dealers, bar owners, even girlfriends left behind in nightclubs whispered into the right ears. Together with the Bureau, the task force mapped the conspiracy outward, beyond the officers themselves to the men who paid them, protected them, and benefited from their silence. The name Luis Rodriguez came up again and again, a nightclub owner with the arrogance of a man who thought the law was just another customer. Rodriguez, though, wasn't untouchable. The Bureau played him like a careful hand of cards. They staged encounters where he believed he was smoothing over problems with his police allies, when in truth, he was being recorded under federal supervision. He cursed subpoenas, muttered about who could be trusted, and let slip details of raids that no civilian should have known. Each slip was another thread tied back to the officers in blue. Still, fear was building inside the corrupt circle. Officers began warning one another to stay alert. The feds are circling, one was overheard saying. They avoided their old haunts, changed meeting spots, turned up radios to drown their words. But paranoia makes men careless. In one recorded call, Rivera reassured a contact that Rodriguez's payments were still steady, that the shipments would keep moving, a statement that placed him not as a bystander, but as a participant in the very trade he was sworn to destroy. By spring of 1986, the Bureau had what they needed: overlapping testimonies, tapes, financial records, and a map of operations that stretched from river docks to nightclubs to the front seats of patrol cars. But evidence isn't enough, not yet. To indict a cop, you need certainty, airtight proof that can survive the best defense lawyer's money can buy. And so the FBI waited a little longer, stacking the file higher, until the weight of it could crush any courtroom doubt. Miami streets hummed with the usual chaos. Salsa rhythms, screeching tires, the lowest of deals struck in alleyways. But in the field offices, agents knew the endgame was approaching. The shadows were almost ready to break into daylight. The summer of 1986 brought Miami a heat thicker than usual. But it wasn't just the weather. The Bureau had finished building its storm, and the thunder was ready to break. For months they had stacked evidence. Ledgers, transcripts, whisper confessions sealed on magnetic tape. Now the only question was execution. How to strike fast enough, hard enough, that no one slipped through the cracks. The operation was codenamed with bureaucratic neatness, but behind the closed doors of the FBI's Miami field office, the agent spoke of it in lower tones, as if naming it aloud might warn the very men they hunted. The plan was sweeping. Indictments for conspiracy, racketeering, and drug trafficking, all tied directly to sworn officers of Metro-Dade. When the files hit a judge's desk, the warrants came back thick as a phone book. The arrests rolled out before dawn. Federal agents and Centac. 26 detectives moved like a tide through the city, house to house, door to door. They took Rivera in silence, his polished Mercedes sitting in the driveway like a monument to arrogance. Garcia was pulled from his bed in gym shorts, blinking at the badges he once claimed as brothers. Even Coyo, the retired prodigy of corruption, was led away for his mansion while neighbors peeked from behind blinds. By morning, Miami woke to the headlines. 17 officers charged in FBI corruption probe. The press called them the River Cops, a name that stuck like oil on water. The Bureau didn't care about the poetry of it. They cared about the facts. In total, more than a dozen officers were indicted on charges ranging from extortion to drug conspiracy. The FBI's recordings, bank documents, and informant testimony formed the backbone of the prosecution. What had begun with 3 bodies rising from the Miami River had unfolded into one of the most sweeping takedowns of police corruption in the city's history. The trials painted a portrait almost too brazen to believe. Jurors heard of night raids disguised as official operations. Smugglers stripped of their cargo under the glare of real flashlights and real handcuffs. They heard of Rodriguez's nightclub deals, envelopes passed like stage props, and patrol officers pocketing cash thicker than their own paychecks. The defense tried to fracture the case, claiming jealousies, vendettas, exaggerations. But the Bureau's patience had made the case bulletproof. Tapes don't lie, and neither do bank records. Convictions came down heavy. Some officers took plea deals, hoping for lighter sentences. Others stood trial and lost. Rodriguez, the nightclub kingpin who once thought he owned a slice of Miami, was sentenced alongside his uniformed partners. The FBI's role was clear in every verdict. They had been the scalpel, the steady hand that cut rot from the bone. Still, the victory tasted bittersweet. The public trust had been gutted. Headlines spoke not just of the men arrested, but the badge itself. For months, citizens wondered how deep the rot had spread, how many other officers walked the same double life. It was the FBI's presence, their methodical professionalism, that reassured the city justice hadn't drowned with those 3 men in the river. When the last gavel fell, Miami was left to rebuild, its police force chasing, its citizens watchful. The Bureau filed its case, thick as a dictionary, into the archives. But agents who worked it never forgot the sight that started it all. Bodies floating in the current, pagers still clipped on, a silent reminder that even the river keeps secrets until someone makes it speak. The Miami River flowed on, indifferent, carried with the memory of 3 men who had surfaced that night in 1985. Their deaths had opened a door, and through that door the FBI stepped, patient, relentless, unblinking. The Bureau's work didn't just topple a crew of corrupt officers. It rewrote how the city saw itself. Miami had long been called the crossroads of cocaine, but now it was also a cautionary tale of what happens when crime seeps into the very uniforms meant to fight it. The aftermath rippled outward. Metro-Dade's leadership launched reforms. Training sharpened, oversight tightened. No one wanted another River Cop scandal etched into the city's history. For citizens, the lesson was harder. Trust, once fractured, doesn't mend quickly. For years, conversations in corner cafes carried the echo of those headlines. Neighbors asking quietly, who else might have been involved? For the FBI, the case became a benchmark. Agents spoke of it in future briefings, a reminder that corruption wears many faces, sometimes even a polished face of authority. The techniques honed in Miami, the long surveillance, the financial forensics, the careful cultivation of informants, became models for investigations nationwide. The Bureau had proved again that its reach extended into the darkest corners. even when those corners lay inside the walls of law enforcement itself. Looking back, the noir of it all feels inevitable. A city lit in neon, where temptation brushed shoulders with duty, where greed could lure even a man in uniform into the undertow. But inevitability is an illusion. The truth is, without the Bureau's patience, without their discipline to follow whispers until they became evidence, to follow shadows until they became names, the story might have ended differently. The river might have claimed its secret forever. Instead, Miami remembers. It remembers the summer when the FBI tore open a conspiracy, when headlines screamed of betrayal and redemption in the same breath. It remembers that justice, though slow, can move like water, wearing down stone, reshaping even the hardest walls. And the river? The river keeps flowing, silent, knowing, carrying away the echoes of time when its dark current exposed the truth.